All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. We are. I want to begin first by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shiur. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the shiur and drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Dina Bas Pesach, Zechariah ben Zechariah. To thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Ephraim and Shifra Abramson, as a zuchus for Refuah Shalema for Moshe Shalom ben Chana Bracha. We hope that on the merits of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamos Lav and Aliyah, the families, right, the families in Chama, as well as those who need a refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Tzadik Vav 96, and we are picking up Emirat Hashem on Tzadik Hamlet Beis 95b. We're picking up about Rabbi Eliezer Omer, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, about 15 lines up from the bottom. Supposed to just reorient ourselves a little bit. So if you remember again, we saw in the Mishnah a very fascinating idea. So the Mishnah spoke about the idea that even if you have a Karban Pesach that was brought B'tumah, halacha l'maisa, that doesn't necessarily allow all individuals who are tamei to go ahead and partake of that particular Karban Pesach. For example, we saw that a Karban Pesach that is brought B'tumah, because remember, that means 51% of Klal Yisrael is Artmeim, Tumas Meis. So the Mishnah said, Zavin, Zavos, Nidos, Yoldos cannot participate in that particular carbon. What the Gemara now is trying to figure out is, okay, I understand they can't participate in it, but as the Mishnah said, if they end up eating it, for example, there's no liability. So what you begin to see is that halacha l'maisa, whereas Tumah will not necessarily allow for an across-the-board consumption, we do see that once the Karban Pesach is being brought to Tumah, certain basic Tumah standards are relaxed. So the Gemara is trying to figure out just the balance between those two things. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yachol dochku zavin v'nichnesu la'azar b'Pesach haba b'Tumah. Yachol yuchayav, and you might have thought that if zavin pushed their way into the Azara. So let's say again, remember, individuals who are zavin, they're not supposed to come into the Azar, into the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. They go ahead and push their way in. You might have thought that they should be chayiv. Says the Gemara, Talmud Lomar, v'yishalchu min ha'machana kol sarah v'chol zav. The pasuk says, you shall send away from the camp any tzarua and any zav, v'chol tamei lanefesh, and anyone who is tamei. So the Gemara says, bizman shetmei mesim mishtalchin, when tmei mesim are sent away from the camp, zav and mitzarah mishtalchin, then zav and mitzarah are sent away as well. Ein Tmei Meisim Mishtalchin, but if Tmei Meisim are not sent away, Ein Zavin u'Mitzarayin Mishtalchin, then a Zavin Mitzarayin are not sent away. So again, we're going to begin to see a number of these type of Tumah relationships. So a number of these different types of circumstances where, although we're going to see that halacha l'maisa, the only people who could eat a Karban Pesach that is brought b'tumah are those who are tamei tumas meis, although again, even that statement is not totally true. We spoke about tumas sheretz before. Clearly the Mishnah is indicating to me that halacha l'maisa, zavin, zavos, nidos, yoldos are not allowed to partake, yet the laws of Tumah are clearly being relaxed. By Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef has an interesting shaila. Listen to this. What happens if, here's the situation. Karban Pesach is being brought to Tumah. 51% of Klal Yisrael are Tamei Tumas Meis, which means they could go ahead and come into the Beis HaMikdash, they come into the Azara, do Karban Pesach. What happens if the Tamei Meisim got a little bit aggressive and pushed their way into the Heichal? So remember again, the Heichal is what we call the primary building of the Mikdash. That is the building in which you have the menorah, the Mizbeach HaZahav, the Shulchan, what we call the Kodesh, and then the curtain, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So what happens if the Tzmei Mesim went ahead and got a little aggressive and pushed their way into the Heichal? Is there liability now? It's fascinating, Shaila. Is there liability for entering into the Heichal in a state of Tumah? So the Gemara says, do we say that once they're allowed into the Azara, which means the laws of Tumah have been suspended, they're allowed into the Heichal as well? O Dilma, my di ishtri, my di lo ishtri. Or we say no. What's permitted is permitted. What's not permitted is not permitted. As I say, there's a lot of profundity in that statement as well, which is how far sometimes one takes certain permissions. Right? Sometimes you have to be makel on something. Right? We see this. We see this fascinatingly even over the pandemic. We see that from there are many especially now thinking back, this has been going on for a year. But you think about, again, as we went through the Yom Tovim last year, Purim, Pesach, so there were certain things that we had to be makel on, certain things that by definition, circumstances necessitated kulas. It's always interesting in the dynamic of life leniencies. So kind of, do we say, heicha de ishtari, certain things are mutter for certain circumstances, but that does not create an ongoing, or do you say, heicha de ishtari, or do you say, my de ishtari, or do you say, midi ishtari. So it's almost as if once something is mutter, does everything become mutter? Or no, sometimes again, certain things have to be mutter for certain circumstances at certain times, but lav dafka, that's an ongoing thing. It's an interesting shaila in halacha, interesting shaila in life. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Amar Kra, V'yishachom min ha'machana, afilu miktsas machana. So Rava says, the pasuk says, they shall send away the tmeim from the machana. So from the machana means even part of the machana. Ikeda, which could mean that halacha l'maisa, even if tumah is permitted, and therefore, for example, Tamei Mesim are permitted in the Azara, that doesn't automatically give them a license to be in the Heichel. Ikeda Amri, an alternate version. Amar Rava Amar Krabi, Shachom in Amachana, Amichutz Lamachana Teshaluchum. The pasuk says, you shall send away the Tameim from the camp, to outside of the camp you shall send them. This is very interesting. Kol Heichel de Karinan Bei Al Michutz Lamachana Teshalchum, Karinan Bei V'Yishachom in Amachana. It is only when you send Tameim out of the camp that ultimately, again, that halacha l'maisa, the din of el michutz lamachane applies. So we'll say a very interesting yisod, that according to this alternate version, it's only when some of the Tameim are sent el michutz lamachane that you go ahead and apply the concept to the yishalchu min hamachane. So according to the second approach, once no one's being sent out of the camp, i.e. because the halachos of tumah have been fundamentally lifted, therefore, again, interestingly enough, there will be no prohibition associated with anyone tameh coming into any part of the Beis HaMikdash. So we'll say, it seems to be this is the conclusion of the Gemara, which is really quite interesting, that were you to have a circumstance where halacha l'maisa, again, Tumah was hutra b'tzibor, so the tzibor is offering up the carbon in a state of Tumah, even though, again, the license for Tumah really only applies for those who are Tamei Meis, you begin to see across the board kulas by all forms of Tumah, even in terms of entry into the Beis HaMikdash. Quite dramatic. Last line, Tzadik Hamid Beis. By Rav Yosef, Dachku Tamei, this is a great case. Let's say again, Dachku Tamei Meisim va'achalem morei Pesach haba b'Tumah. Shabbos said, listen to this. What happens if the Tmei Mesim, you have a current Pesach that's being offered up in a state of Tumah, the Tmei Mesim are getting a little bit rowdy. So what did they do? Not only did they push their way in, but they ate sacrificial parts. Imurim, they ate sacrificial parts that would normally be offered up on the Mizbeach. What's the halacha? Top of Tzadik Vav. Mahu. Midi ishtri tumas basar ishtri nami tumas emurin. So do we say that once halacha l'maisa, the tumas basar was removed, that tumas emurin is removed as well? O dilma my di ishtri, my di lo ishtri, or no, maybe the concept of a carbon being offered up in tumah is dafka situation for the basar. It's not a din in the emurin. So amarava michdi. Let's analyze this. Tumas emurin meheches Rabbi. From where do we learn tumas emurin? Mitumas basar. Dichsev. Asher laHashem lerabos es haemurin. Kol heicha di isi letumas basar isi letumas emurin. Whenever there is a din of tumas basar, there is a din of tumas in the sacrificial parts. Kol heicha de leise letumas basar leise letumas emurin. But bepashtus, wherever there is no tumas basar, there's no tumas emurin as well. Okay, so by Rabbi Zera, Emure Pesach Mitzrayim Heicha Aktrina Bose. Now this is just fascinating. Again, these Gemaras are really just fascinating. So Rabbi Zera asks, by the way, now that you spoke about sacrificial parts, where did they burn the sacrificial parts of the Karban Pesach? Pesach Mitzrayim, right? The first Karban Pesach, I will say. So where did they burn the sacrificial parts? In other words, remember again, sacrificial parts are normally burnt where? Mizbeach. There was Bepashtos, there was no Mizbeach in Mitzrayim. Pesach Mitzrayim. So where did they take care of the sacrificial parts in Pesach Mitzrayim? Amalei Abaye, Uman Leimalon. Man Leimalon. Delo Sheviski Avud. So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, Sheviski is Basar Tzli B'Shipur. So interestingly enough, so Rabbi says, maybe there were no sacrificial parts in Mitzrayim, and they ate everything. Shavisky means like they made it into like a dish, like a roast. So maybe they just ate everything. In other words, Mehechatei saying that there was a din of a murid in Pesach Mitzrayim. Bepashtos, they ate everything. Vod, Hatan Rav Yosef, Gimel Mizbechos Hayusham. In fact, I will say this is quite beautiful. The Gemara says that there were 3 Mizbechos in Mitzrayim. What were the 3 Mizbechos, the 3 altars? Ala Mashkov Va'al Shtei HaMezuzos. The 3 altars were, right, the doorway, the top post, and the 2 side posts. Ultimately, again, those were the 3 mizbechos. And also remember, again, what was applied to those areas was the blood, the sacrificial blood. So interestingly enough, if you want to get technical, it almost sounds like Pesach Mitzrayim had zrika, so to speak, right? The zrika was done onto the altar of Egypt, and the altar of Egypt was your doorway. But interestingly enough, there were no sacrificial parts. There are no sacrificial parts by Pashtos. It sounds like the entire Karban by Pesach Mitzrayim was consumed. Quite fascinating. So Mosai Sinab, interestingly enough, we continue to speak about, once the Gemara introduced this concept of Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Doros, another Mishnah that deals with this distinction. So Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros. So Mosai, what is the distinction between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros? First Pesach, what we call Pesach Mitzrayim, the first Pesach, Pesach Doros, the Pesach for future generations. So a couple of distinctions. Number 1, Pesach Mitzrayim mikcho ba'asar, v'taun haza'ah ba'agudas ezov, v'al hamashkov v'al shtei hamazuzos. So we'll say, distinction number 1, Pesach Mitzrayim was purchased or was taken and brought into your home on the 10th of Nisan. The 10th of Nisan. We call this the concept of bikur. Bikur means the Karban was examined to make sure that it was free from blemish 4 days before its offering. That's a din in Pesach Mitzrayim, is not a din in Pesach Doros. Next, number 2, Pesach Mitzrayim, the blood had to be applied on the doorways and on the top post, ultimately again with Agudas Ezov, a bundle of hyssop. So blood application with a bundle of hyssop, din in Pesach Mitzrayim, not a din in Pesach Doros. Next, v'nechal b'chipazon, and ultimately again Pesach Mitzrayim was eaten with haste, chipazon, that didn't apply to Pesach Doros. B'layla echad, in one night. We'll have to discuss what exactly that means, because the Pashtos Pesach Doros is also consumed in one night, but we'll see. B'layla achos, u'Pesach Doros nohi kol shema. Whereas ultimately, again, Pesach Doros applies all 7 days. So we'll say, so fascinating list of distinctions. Again, we'll have to define what that last one means, because it can't mean that literally Pesach, becoming Pesach for future generations is offered up 7 days, because that's not true. We'll see in the Gemara what it means. So I will say, but bottom line distinctions are Pesach Mitzrayim bought on the 10th, doesn't apply Pesach Doros. Pesach Mitzrayim, blood applications on the side post, the top post, doesn't with a bundle of hyssop, doesn't apply for Pesach Doros. Pesach Mitzrayim, chipazon, eaten in haste, doesn't apply to Pesach Doros. And lastly, again, the one we don't really understand is Pesach Mitzrayim. The Gemara says, Mishnah says, is eaten for 1 night versus Pesach Doros for 7. We'll have to define that last one. Says the Gemara, Minalan. From where do we know this? From where do we know? We'll say, addressing the first one. From where do we know that by Pesach Mitzrayim, the Karban was taken on the 10th? So the Gemara says, well, the pasuk says, "D'chsev dabra kol adas Yisrael lemor be'asor lachodesh hazeh v'yikchu." Pasuk says, on the 10th of the month, they will purchase their Karban Pesach. So I'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara darshans, zeh mikcho ba'asar, vein Pesach Doros mikcho ba'asar. We learn from this pasuk that it's dafka zeh. It's dafka this Pesach, i.e., Pesach Mitzrayim that is purchased on the 10th, but in future generations, it does not work this way. I will say, remember again, just to give you the illustration, we saw this, we've seen this in other Masechtas, this idea that, remember, again, a lot of times, not a lot, they used to sell sacrificial animals in the Beis HaMikdash, right? Which makes a lot of sense, because if you're traveling from out of town, you don't want to go ahead and have to schlep livestock with you. So they would sell animals, right? There was the Lishkas Hatloim. They would go ahead and sell animals in the Beis HaMikdash. So Bepashtos, the Gemara and Sefer, I'm sure you had plenty, I would think that you had plenty of people who were showing up on Erev Pesach, purchasing an animal in the marketplaces of Yerushalayim or in the Beis HaMikdash itself. But halacha l'maisa, so therefore this din of mikcho ba'asar, the Gemara darshans, was dafka Pesach Mitzrayim, not Pesach Doros. So the Gemara says, sorry, ve'im Pesach Doros mikcho ba'asar. It was only first Pesach, we call Pesach Mitzrayim, that you bought it on the 10th, but not Pesach Doros. Ela me'ata. But using this logic, so we'll say the pasuk says, and you shall guard the carbon, so it shall be for you for a guarding up until the 14th of this month, which again, pasuk is referring to Pesach Mitzrayim. You would watch the carbon for 4 days. Hachanami zeh ta'un bikar dalad yom kodin shchita ve'in acher ta'un bikar. So we'll say, again, I would be, first wide line, Tzadik Vav Mandalim. I would be tempted. How do I interpret this pasuk? The Rabbi say the din of bikur. The din of bikur means keeping an animal under your personal surveillance to make sure that it does not become blemished. So based on the way you dash in the pasuk, I would say the din of bikur only applies to Pesach Mitzrayim, doesn't apply to future generations. But is that true? Vatanya Ben Bagbag Omer, Minayin Litamid Sheton Beaker Dalidam Kodim Shchita. Wow. How do I know about say that the carbon tamid actually requires bikur? A carbon tamid must be kept under watch to ensure that it is free from blemish 4 days before that it's offered. Shenemar Tishmeru Lakriv Liba Moado Ulahalanu Omer Vahayalachem Mishmeres Ad Arbasar. Malahalan ta'un bikar dalad yam kodim shchita, afkan ta'ar bikar dalad yamim kodim shchita. So we'll say this is incredible. The Gemara makes a gzer shava between Tamid and Pesach Mitzrayim. To say just like Pesach Mitzrayim required bikor 4 days before the carbon was offered up, so to a carbon Tamid requires bikor 4 days before it's offered up. So we'll say, so we do see that we learn out from Pesach Mitzrayim contemporary obligation for Bikar. Now, albeit this is being learned out for Tamid, but if it applies to Tamid, can't one make a cogent argument that halacha l'mais again it should apply for Pesach Doros as well? To which the Gemara says, no, shiny hasam dichsiv tishmeru. So we'll say, no, it's a little bit different because, like we said, it's Gzer Shava. It uses the same lashon by Pesach Mitzrayim as it does by Carbon Tamid. So you can make a Gzer Shava to say, just like Pesach Mitzrayim required Bikur, so too Tamid required Bikur, or requires Bikur. Pesach Doros nami kaksiv va'avarata es ha'avoda hazos b'chodesh hazeh shiyu kol avodos chodesh zeh kazeh. But I kedarshin at Pesach Doros. What does the pasuk say? You shall perform this avoda in this month. And I kedarshin that all of the avodos done during this month should resemble the original avoda. In other words, I can make a cogent argument that Pesach Mitzrayim should really mimic Pesach Doros, if in not every way, at least when it comes to how you deal with the carbon, and therefore Pesach Doros should require bikur as well. To which the Gemara says, Hazeh lemeute Pesach Sheni dikavase. Ultimately, again, Hazeh is coming to exclude Pesach Sheni. Alameata, but if that's the case, Alameata dichsiv va'achles habasar balayla Hazeh. The pasuk says you shall eat the meat on this night. Hachanami tizeh ne'echal balayla ve'in acher ne'echal balayla. So what are you going to dash? We'll say that it's only Pesach Mitzrayim where the carbon is consumed at night, but in future generations it's not consumed at night. Amar Kra va'avarata es ha'avoda. Therefore, the pasuk says you shall perform this avoda. So we'll say we're going to see this over and over. That interestingly enough, this phrase va'avarata es ha'avoda, is the phrase that the Gemara uses to create what we'll call carbonic consistency, to tell us that details which are really inherent to the actual preparation and consumption of the carbon, those details remain for all future generations as well. Secondary details like bikur or like blood applications on the mashkaf and on the mezuzos, those will not apply. So that's va'avadat havoda. Ela hazeh lamali. So what do I do with the word hazeh? The chid Rabbi Elazar ben Azai Rabbi Akiva. So also again we'll discuss Rabbi Elazar ben Azai Rabbi Akiva. They discuss ultimately again there's machlokes about the timing for consumption of carbon Pesach. Can carbon Pesach be eaten until the morning, or could it be consumed only until Chatzos? According to the opinion who holds that it's until Chatzos, where does he get that from? He gets it from the word hazeh. It says hazeh by carbon Pesach, and it says hazeh by makas bechoros. When did makas bechoros happen? When? What time? Chatzos. Chatzos. So just like hazeh by makas bechoros means midnight, so to hazeh, according to at least one opinion, by carbon Pesach means until midnight. Okay. Elameata dechsiv v'chol aral lo yochal bo. So I will say, when the pasuk says by Pesach Mitzrayim that a aral, someone who's uncircumcised, someone who's uncircumcised is not allowed to eat it. Hachanami, so I can make the argument, debo eina ochel aval ochel b'Pesach toros. So we'll say maybe the halacha is like this. Maybe only an aral is not allowed to eat Pesach Mitzrayim. Maybe arelos is a din of Pesach Mitzrayim, but by Pesach Doros, an aral can eat. Amarkra va'avarata. So we'll say you begin to see the same thing over and over. It says va'avarata avoda. You perform the avoda, namely the avoda of carbon Pesach is the same throughout. It's the same on Pesach Mitzrayim, the same on Pesach Doros. Ela bo lamali. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, then why do I need bo? Because we'll say, here's what throws us off. When the Torah speaks about the original Pesach, it says, v'chol oral lo yochal bo. So it could. So if it would have just said b'chol oral lo yochal, I would say okay. The Torah is giving me a din in Hilchos Carbon Pesach in general. Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Doros. When you say b'chol oral lo yochal bo, Rabbosai seems to indicate what? Bo you can be understood as Pesach Mitzrayim, but yet we say va'avaratas havoda hazos. The avoda for Pesach always remains the same. Fine. So therefore, an oral can't eat Pesach Mitzrayim, it can't eat Pesach Doros. So why do I need the word bo? What does that come to add? Here we go. Bo eino ochel, aval hu ochel b'matzah u'morer. Bo says very interesting. It is true, the aral cannot eat of carbon Pesach, but the aral can eat of matzah and morer. Interesting. Elameata kol benechar lo yochal bo hachenami de bo eino ochel aval ochel hu Pesach Ladoros. So we'll say, so maybe I could say, when it says called Ben Nechar Lechor, so we'll say, so remember again, Ben Nechar, if you look at Rashi, this is actually an interesting phrase. Ben Nechar, Rashi says, is a Meshumad, an apikoris, a Jew. So a Jew, ultimately again, who just simply, what's the best way, a Jew who actively renounces his Yiddishkeit. So a Meshumar who goes against Torah, goes against mitzvahs. Shenisnachru ma'asav la'av v'shashai. So also remember again, to be very clear, a ben nechar is not a person who might not be observant, who might not be. This is talking about someone who's antagonistic, right? Religiously antagonistic. So someone who actively goes against the mitzvos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a desire to go ahead and rebel. So the Gemara says, Kol benechar lo yochal bo. So same issue. Pasuk says a benechar can't go ahead and eat carbon Pesach. Hachanami de bo eino ochal aval ochel Pesach l'doro. So we'll say, so once again, it's that bow that throws us a little bit. So I look at that pasuk and I say to myself, maybe a ben nechar, a meshuma, did not be kores. He can't eat carbon Pesach. He can't eat Pesach Mitzrayim, but maybe he can eat Pesach. So we'll say, by the way, it's interesting, right? You think about this for just a moment. He's an apikoris. So why is he showing up to eat carbon Pesach? Why is this even a kasha? So there's a couple of answers. Simple answer is, everybody likes a good meal, right? That's okay. Let's say, but on a much more profound level, even the apikoris shows up at some time. Rabbi Soloveitchik says very beautifully, he says, The word tshuva is, of course, as we know, from the lashon of lashuv, from the lashon of to return. He says, Soloveitchik writes, life is a circle. Life is a circle. The only variable is the circumference or the diameter of that circle. Right? Soloveitchik says sometimes the circle has a radius anaki, sometimes it has a large radius, sometimes a small radius. Everyone comes back. Everyone comes back. Some people come back with a desire to come back. Some people can't admit that they want to come back, but for some reason the Meshumad shows up at the Karban Pesach. So the idea being never give up on anyone. Never give up on any person. Because even the Ben Nechar, even the Meshumad, you'll be surprised when he walks through the door for the Karban Pesach. Because sometimes even when people put on a particular show, they want to look like they reject or they resent. Deep down, the neshama truly desires and the neshama truly wants. Everyone comes back to the Ribono Shel Olam. It's just a question of how, just a question of when. Pretty incredible. So Moshe said, I might have thought that therefore it says, Kol ben Nechar lo yochal bo. I might have thought that this din only applies to Pesach Mitzrayim, not to Pesach Doros. Amar Kra va'avarta. Therefore the pasuk of Moshe, again, we keep coming back to the same phrase. Va'avarta, the avoda for Pesach Doros will be the same as Pesach Mitzrayim. Ela bo lamali. So why does it say bo? In other words, again, it gets that same question. Because when you say Kol ben Nechar lo yochal bo, remember, the topic that's being discussed over here is Pesach Mitzrayim. So if you don't mean to limit the Ben Nechar's ineligibility to Pesach Mitzrayim, so then why say the word bo? The Gemara says, bo hamaras das poselas, vein hamaras das poselas. Bitruma. So most of this is very interesting. It's only being a meshumad only precludes you from eating Karban Pesach. It doesn't preclude you from eating truma. So, for example, if you have a kohen who's an apikoris or a kohen who's a meshumad, halacha l'maaseh he can eat truma. Right? Very interesting. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, "Ve'itzrich l'michtav aral, ve'itzrich l'michtav ben nechar." So what's actually very interesting now? Why do you have to write both aral and ben nechar? Right? An aral is someone who's uncircumcised. Ben nechar is someone who is a meshumad. So the Gemara says, why do I have to write both? I'll tell you why. Dikas of Rachmana aral mishum demais. If the Torah would have excluded an aral from Karban Pesach, I would have said, literally, an aral, ma'is also means disgusting, which means is there's something about the aral which is physically repulsive, right? From a Judaic perspective. There's something about him that is physically repulsive. That's why he's not allowed to go ahead and be part of the Karban Pesach. Aval ben nechar lo ma'is. Both say this is wild, no? The ben nechar is not ma'is. Like the ben nechar, the meshumid is not ma'is. So we'll say, isn't this fascinating? Isn't this fascinating? So we'll say, what's the pshat over here? So the pshat is, of course, when someone has a bris milah, there is a covenant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is emblazoned on their body. It's emblazoned on their body. So what once you have that, by definition, whatever your hashkafas or beliefs are, l'maisa, again, you're within the covenant of the Ribono Shel Olam. But ultimately, again, and therefore, if you don't have that covenant, there's a certain type of mius that's there. Masha'in kain, when a person is a meshumad, amazingly enough, although again they're hashkafas, and it's not just their hashkafas, like their entire mindset is so spiritually repugnant, yet from a halachic perspective, they are Judaically intact, which most say is such an incredible yesod. Okay, we have to get through this. It's so fascinating because the Gemara is looking at two people who are removed from the fold. One removed from the fold physically because of a physical difference, and one removed from the fold because of an ideological difference. And it's so fascinating to see the importance. Remember, again, this goes back to the Gemara. You know, the Gemara, I think it was in Shabbos or Brachas, where David HaMelech was in the bathhouse, and he was very distressed because he felt that he had no mitzvahs. He had no mitzvahs. But then he saw that he had bris milah. His milah was with him, so to speak. So he had bris milah, and this comforted him. That's the power of bris. In other words, it's a covenantal sign and a mitzvah that is with me no matter what. I could divest myself of all other mitzvahs except for bris. Except for bris. All right, so the Gemara says, therefore, v'yashvoina benechar, both say, now the Gemara advances the exact opposite argument. If it would have excluded Ben Nechar, I would have said, okay, Ben Nechar is excluded. Why? Ein libo l'shamayim. His heart is not with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Aval Orel de libo l'shamayim emolo. But an Orel whose heart is with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he just has a physical issue, then ultimately, again, maybe he shouldn't be excluded. Therefore, tzricha. So therefore, we'll say the Torah has to state both Orel and Ben Nechar can't participate. Elamiata. Toshav v'sacher lo yochal bo. Hachanami debohu eno ochel. Aval ochel hu b'Pesach Torah. So we'll say when the Torah excludes a toshav and a sachir. So the Gemara says, once again, I would have thought it's only in Pesach Doros that they can, sorry, only Pesach Mitzrayim they can't participate. Pesach Doros they can. The Gemara says, Amakra va'avarata, same phrase avarata, ela bo lamali, bo hamaras das poseles, ve'ein hamaras das poseles b'shuma. So I just want to point out, Rashi actually removes this entire section from the Gemara. This is because it doesn't read right. The Gemara answers Hamaras Das, which is Apikarsis. Apikarsis has nothing to do with Toshav and Sachir. So Rashi actually removes this section. So we'll go weiter. Elameata umalta oso az yochabo. The pasuk says, "You shall circumcise your aved, and then he could eat in it." So we'll say, now I want to point out to you what that means is, if you have uncircumcised avodim, they also preclude you from participating in Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says, so once again, I would have thought this only applies to Pesach, but not to Pesach Doros. Amakra, va'avarata, we'll say same Gemara. Va'avarata, ela bo lamali. So why do I need the phrase bo? So the Gemara says, bo milas zechara va'avada ma'keves, ve'milas zechara va'avada ma'keves betruma. Well, it's teaching a very interesting halacha, that having uncircumcised slaves only prevents you from participating in Pesach. But for example, if I'm a Kohen, it would not preclude me or prevent me from eating Truma. The pasuk says, by Pesach Mitzrayim you can't break a bone. Once again, I will say, it's the same Gemara. It's over and over. Bo. That's what this is. So bo seems to be such a limiting phrase. So etzem lo yishbaru bo. Oh, you can't break bones in the Pesach. When? Pesach Mitzrayim, but Pashtos not by Pesach Doros. Amakra va'avarata. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk says va'avarata. The avoda of this month of Pesach must be the same throughout all of the generations. So the Gemara says, "Ela bo lamali." But why do I need bo? Bo bebasar velo bepasal. Oh, sorry, bekasha velo bepasal. Then I will say the din of shviras etzem only applies in a Korban Pesach that is kosher, not in a Pesach that is pasal. Ela me'ata dechsev. Al tochlu mimenu na. So we'll say the pasuk says you shall not eat of it raw. Mimenu iata ochel, ata ochel na b'Pesach Torah. So once again, you would have said you only can't eat of Pesach Mitzrayim when it's raw, but maybe Pesach Doros I can. Amakra va'avarata. There we'll say the pasuk says va'avarata ela mimenu lamali. So why do I need the word mimenu, which seems to be limiting? L'chidra ba'am Rabbi Yitzchak. But we'll say ultimately again, like Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, namely the halacha l'maiser. Rashi said over here, Peraka oral nemar imenu b'Pesach v'nemar b'maiser ma'lalon oral asur b'Pesach avkar. So Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak that it teaches me that just it's used for Gzera Shava between Pesach and Maiser, and to teach me that the same way that an oral can't eat of Pesach, an oral also can't eat of Maiser. So we'll say what comes out is that halacha l'maiser. Although it's interesting that the Torah goes ahead and phrases a lot of the halachos of Korban Pesach by Pesach Mitzrayim and attaches limiting words to those halachos. Bo, mimenu, the phrase of va'avarata es ha'avoda hazos miyamim yamima, va'avarata es ha'avoda hazos, you will do this avoda, says the avoda of Pesach Mitzrayim becomes the ongoing avoda for Pesach throughout all of the generations, with the exceptions as listed in the Mishnah. Good. Let's go right to Pesach Doros Noi Kol Shiva. So also remember again, the last cryptic statement of the Mishnah was that whereas Pesach Mitzrayim only applies for one night, Pesach Doros applies, Korban Pesach for Pesach Doros applies all 7 days. The Gemara says, Amai Kai, what are you talking, in other words, what is that referring to? Ilei ma'a Pesach, Pesach Kol Shiva mi'ika. I will say, is the Mishnah saying that Korban Pesach for Pesach Doros applies all 7 days? That obviously cannot be the case. Amud days, Ella Achometz. Rather, it refers to say is the Isra of Chometz. That whereas that it sounds like what it's saying is Pesach Mitzrayim, maybe chametz only applied at the time the carbon was being offered, but by Pesach Doros, the Isser chametz applies all 7 days. Gemara says, 1 second, Michlal, the Pesach Mitzrayim Laila Echad V'Sulo, are you coming to tell me that by Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isser chametz only applied for 1 night, and that's all? The Gemara says, V'atanya, Rabbi Yosef Lili Omer Minayin LaPesach Mitzrayim Shein Chimutzo Noig Elo Yom Echad, Talmud Lomar Lo Yochal Chametz, V'samich Lei Hayom Atem Yotzim, Hayom Atem Yotzim. Shabbos says, so first of all, even if you hold that the Isser Chametz of Pesach Mitzrayim did not span the entire 7 days, it lasted for at least what? 1 complete day. 1 complete day, which means that the Isser wasn't just for the night of Pesach, it was at least 1 complete day. So what does the Mishnah mean? Elachi Kamar, Laila Echad, V'adin LaPesach Doros, V'chimutzo Kol Hayom, U'Pesach Doros Nohei Kol Shiva. Rather, Rabbi say what it means is as follows, that the distinction the Mishnah is making is, when it comes to the Isser Chametz, this is actually very interesting. So for Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isser Chametz lasted only 1 day, but 1 full day. So the night when the Pesach started, throughout that first day of Yom Tiv, but by Pesach Doros, the Isser Chametz lasts for the 6 following days, for the full 7 days. So Moshe, therefore, what comes out of the Mishnah is Halacha L'Maisa. The distinctions between Karban Pesach or Pesach Mitzrayim, Pesach Doros is number 1, Pesach Mitzrayim Mikcho Ba'asar, you bought it on the 10th, 4 days beaker, right? That does not apply by Pesach. That does not apply by Pesach Doros. Next, the sprinkling of the blood on the doorposts, right, and on the top post, Pesach Mitzrayim, not Pesach Doros. Next, also with a bundle of hyssop. Next, chipazon, which the interesting of the Gemara really didn't discuss. Pesach Mitzrayim eaten with haste. Pesach Doros not. The reason the Gemara doesn't discuss that is why I will say. Why? That's much more intuitive, right? Because remember again, why was Pesach Mitzrayim consumed b'chipazon? Because they had to go, right? They literally were going. So that's an understandable distinction. And lastly, again, is a din in chametz. Pesach Mitzrayim, the Isser Chametz lasted 1 day. Pesach Doros, 7 days. Beautiful. Let's go right to Rabbi Yeshua. But say, so now some really fascinating halachas with karbanos. Really fascinating. So Rabbi Yeshua, Shamati, I heard, Shetmuras Pesach Kreva, Utemuras Pesach Ena Kreva. So I'll say, this is actually interesting. So I want to point out what's happening over here. We're talking now about Temura. The word Temura could be used in 2 different ways. There's classic Temura. Everyone knows classic Temura, right? It's classic Temura, right? I have a carbon that is set aside for a shlamim, just for argument's sake. And I say, right, animal A. I say, you know what? I don't want to offer up animal, and I already designated it. I don't want to offer up A. Instead, I want to swap A for B. I'm going to offer up B. That's called Temura, swapping. You're not allowed to do that. And if you do that, what happens if you engage in carbonic swapping? I'll say what happens? Vayahu usmuraso kodesh, both animals become consecrated. So there's like a penalty. Both animals become. So when it comes to Karban Pesach, Temura also takes on a different idea, which is as follows: I separated an animal for Karban Pesach. Fantastic. But I say then what happens? I lose the animal. It runs away. I misplace it. Whatever it is, I can't find it. So what do? I go ahead and I identify. Right? I purchase another animal. I will say, then what happens? I find the first. So now we'll say that's also called Temura. Now, again, in that case, I didn't do anything wrong. In that case, I lost my original animal. I identified, right? I designated a replacement animal. But now the shaila comes up with, okay, so what happens with the 2 animals? So now, so with that background, Shamati, Shetmuras Pesach Kreva, Temuras Pesach Ina Kreva. I heard that sometimes Temuras Pesach is offered as a shlamim, and sometimes it's not. The Indi lefarish, but I don't know which is when. Right? I don't know what is what. Rabbi Akiva ani yefarish. Rabbi Akiva says, let me explain it to you. HaPesach shenim sakodem shchitas HaPesach. So we'll say, listen to this. If you lose your, we'll call it animal A. It's Karban Pesach. I designated animal A. I lost A, therefore designated B. So Rabbi Akiva says like this. If you find A before you ended up offering B, so you have to allow A to graze, right? To graze until it develops a mum. Then you go ahead and sell it. The yavi bidam of shlamim, and then you could go ahead and then use the money to purchase a shlamim. V'chein temura. So similarly, the same thing would happen if you would actively try to swap out the animal. Achar shchitas haPesach. But if you find A after B has already been offered, karav shlamim. Ultimately, again, you could immediately offer up B as a shlamim, dechein temura. And the same is true ultimately again for the temura. Now, both said, let's talk about this for just a moment because it's actually quite fascinating. Take a look at Rashi at Pesach. Sha'avad v'hifish acher tachtov. So we'll say, so remember again, in the Mishnah's case, I have a korban Pesach, I lost it, right? I lost animal A, and I have a replacement Pesach now with B. So what happens? So there are two cases, I will say. In both cases, I'm finding B. What's the variable here? What's the variable? When you find B. Do you find B before you offered A or after you offered? I'm sorry, just the opposite. I find A, right? A is the one that's lost, right? A was my original animal, got lost, replaced it with B. Now I find A again. The shaila is, when I find A, before B was offered or after B was offered? So look at Rashi. Rashi says, so the first case is where I find A before I offered B. The haya ome lefanenu b'shas shchita, hare kavaso b'shas shchita b'shem Pesach. V'zeh shelo ikrivo dacheyu be'adayim lo yikarev od hu atzmo shlamim de'ein zeh mosar Pesach al-Pesach. Listen to this. This is fascinating. So when A is found before B is offered, what do I have in front of me, Rabbi Osai? I have two karbanos. So now when I end up offering up B, A can't be offered up as a shlamim. Why? Because A was actively designated as a Pesach, and it was around b'shas shchita. So because of that, I cannot go ahead and offer up A as a shlamim. Instead, what I have to do, so it's called, it was nidche. It was nidche for being a shlamim. So I have to let it graze, develop a mum, sell it, use the money to purchase shlamim. I will say mashe'en ke. Now you understand the second case, where same thing. I have A, lose A, replace it with B. But now in this case, suppose I offer up B, so I've offered up my korban Pesach, and I find A afterwards. When you find A after B has been offered, you could immediately offer up A as a shlamim. Because since A was not extant, since A was not there, at the time the korban Pesach was being offered, its identity as a Pesach is not solidified and concretized, and therefore when you find it, you could offer it up as a shlamim. Let's see, you hear that distinction? So again, we're going to see more in the Gemara, but that's way of introduction. Says the Gemara, Valema Pesach Karav uPesach Eno Karav. So I'll say, this is actually interesting. Why do you have to say Pesach Kreva uTmuras Pesach Eno Kreva? Why don't you just say there's a case where the Pesach is offered and the Pesach is not offered? Says the Gemara, Hakamash Malan Diika Tmuras HaPesach Telo Karva. To teach you that there's a case of Tmuras Pesach. There is a case where you have a substitute korban Pesach where it's not offered up. So says the Gemara, Itma Rabba Amar Kodem Shchita Ula Achar Shchita Shaninu. So we'll say, as the way I explained it to you before, everything depends. We'll say, right, what you do with A. Remember again, A was the original korban that was lost and then recovered. How you deal with A. Namely, there are two possibilities. Whether you can immediately offer up A as a shlamim right now, or you have to let A graze, develop a mum, sell it, and then use the money to purchase a shlamim. That is fundamentally dependent on when you find A. If you found it before the shchita of B or after the shchita of B. Rabbi Zera Amar, no. Kodem chatzos ula akar chatzos shani. Rabbi said this is fascinating. Rabbi Zera says no. It's fundamentally dependent on. Did you find it before chatzos of Erev Pesach or after chatzos on Erev Pesach? Because I will say, what that will depend, therefore, is, do you have another korban that is ready to be offered or not? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Zera, hakatani kodem shchitas haPesach. Rabbi Zera, the Mishnah says that what you do with A is fundamentally dependent on shchita. Ema kodem zman shchitas haPesach. Rabbi Zera will say the Mishnah meant to say zman shchitas haPesach. Kitanai, the Gemara says machlokes tanaim haPesach shenimtza kodem shchita. If a korban Pesach is found ultimately before shchita, yira, then you go ahead and you set it out to graze. It's the same process. You go ahead and you let it graze, develop a mum, then use the money to purchase. La'achar chatzos yikari. But if you go ahead and you find it after chatzos, then halacha l'maisa, again, it could be offered up immediately. Otherwise, we have to stop over here. But just understand, this is really an incredibly riveting sugya. So we're going to see again that halacha l'maisa, what you do ultimately, again, with a korban that is lost and found, whether you could offer it up immediately or whether halacha lamaisa, again, you have to let it graze, is going to be fundamentally dependent on when you can find it. I will say, we'll pick up here tomorrow. Just remind you, Mir Hashem, tomorrow, again, shiur starts at 5:45 a.m. Davening in Meretz Hashem is at 6:30, and also we'll say there's a basket for Machzis HaShekel if anybody wants to perform the mitzvah right between Kalman Akiva and Menachem Schoenfeld right over here. Let's say Shekayach.